For the longest time, I thought a legacy was something you build, a monument to your work, your name carved in granite, solid and permanent. My dad, he built things, buildings mostly, but he also built a reputation, and that's what he left me. He left me Miller and Son Construction, a name that was once a mark of pride in this city, and a reputation so shoddy it felt like a curse. It clung to the company like the smell of wet concrete, a stubborn stain I couldn't scrub out no matter how hard I tried. I was Nate Miller, the son, the inheritor of a legacy of cut corners and whispered warnings. And then there was Peterson, City Inspector Peterson. He was a creature of pure distilled regulation, a man who seemed to derive a quiet, almost spiritual satisfaction from the hiss of a red tag being slapped onto a fresh sheet of drywall. For any other contractor in town, he was a nuisance, a tax on their time. For me, he was a predator. He stalked my job sites, his eyes scanning for the tiniest flaw, the one in a million infraction. A screw head not perfectly flush, a piece of insulation compressed a quarter of an inch too much. He'd write it up, shut down the work, and walk away with a look of grim satisfaction, leaving my foreman shaking his head and my clients fuming. It felt personal. It was too precise, too relentless to be anything else. He was bleeding me dry, one tiny, indefensible cut at a time. Every delay, every fine, every failed inspection was another shovelful of dirt on the coffin of my company. The final straw came on a Tuesday, the Harrison Tower project. It was our lifeline, the one job big enough to pull us out of the red and maybe, just maybe, rebuild our name. We were on schedule, on budget, and the work was good. I'd made sure of it. I was on site myself 3 times a day, checking every detail, leaving nothing to chance. Peterson arrived at 10 in the morning, his clipboard held like a scepter. He spent 3 hours on the fourth floor, a floor we had just finished framing. My foreman, Frank, a man whose face was a roadmap of 30 years in the business, followed him like a nervous shadow. I got the call from Frank around 1. His voice was tight. He shut us down, Nate. The whole floor, said the anchor bolt spacing on the south-facing shear wall was off by 1/8 of an inch on 3 separate studs. 1/8 of an inch. We both knew it was structurally irrelevant. We both knew any other inspector would have let it go with a note on the punch list. But this was Peterson. This was his art form. That shutdown cost me a week of work and a penalty clause with the developer that wiped out our profit margin for the entire month. It was a kill shot, and he knew it. That night, sitting in my dad's old office, surrounded by faded photos of long-finished buildings and the lingering scent of cigar smoke, I finally admitted it to myself. I was going to lose. The company, the legacy, all of it. Peterson was a cancer, and he was choking the life out of Miller and Son. My only hope was a loan. A big one, just to stay afloat long enough to finish the Harrison project and hope for a miracle. And for a loan that big, I needed collateral, real collateral, so I started digging. I went past the neat, organized files of my tenure and into the dusty, forgotten archives of my father's reign. I was looking for old deeds, equipment titles, anything the bank might see as value. What I found was something else entirely. It started with a small leather-bound ledger tucked away in the back of a filing cabinet labeled Operating Expenses Miscellaneous. It felt heavy, important. I opened it. The first page was dated 1988. The handwriting was my dad's, a sharp, decisive script. It wasn't a list of expenses, it was a list of payments. Payoffs. Inspector Davies' site visit fee, $500. Inspector Cole's expedited permit, $1,000. It went on for years, a meticulous record of the grease that kept the wheels of Miller and Son turning. The shoddy reputation wasn't just a result of carelessness, it was a line item in the budget. My stomach turned. This was the foundation my company was built on. Not concrete and steel, but bribes and corruption. I felt a wave of nausea, a mix of anger and shame. I almost threw the book across the room, but something made me keep looking. At the bottom of the box, underneath a stack of old tax returns, was a thick manila envelope, yellowed with age. No label. I opened it. Inside was a single newspaper clipping. folded into a neat square. The headline read, Scaffolding Collapse at Miller Construction Site, Worker Critically Injured. I read the article, my blood turning to ice. May 12, 1989. A 40-foot scaffold at a downtown site had given way. One man, a carpenter named John Peterson, had fallen. He'd survived, but with injuries that the article described as crippling and life-altering. The official investigation, it said, had concluded weeks later. The cause was deemed a catastrophic materials failure, and the incident was ruled no fault. Miller and Son Construction was cleared of all wrongdoing. The last paragraph was short. It was about the victim's family. It mentioned he had a wife and a young son, a teenage boy who had just started a summer job on a different crew, a young man named Peterson. And in that dusty, silent office, everything clicked into place. The world shifted on its axis. The years of relentless inspections, the nitpicking, the feeling of a personal vendetta, it all snapped into focus. This wasn't a hard-ass inspector trying to destroy me out of professional spite. This was a son, grown into a man, who had found his way into the one position of power where he could slowly, methodically, and legally exact a pound of flesh. He wasn't trying to destroy me. He was trying to force me to pay a debt I never even knew my family owed. Before you hear the rest of this story and how I dealt with this ghost from my father's past, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. It really helps the channel, and you won't want to miss how this ends. Let me know in the comments what you would have done in my shoes. The silence in that office was absolute. It was the kind of deep, heavy quiet that presses in on you, thick with the ghosts of past decisions. I sat there for what felt like hours, the ledger on one side of the desk, the yellowed clipping on the other. They were like two pieces of a puzzle I had never known existed, and now that they were connected, the picture they formed was grotesque. My father hadn't just been a man who cut corners, he had been a man who bought his way out of consequences. He hadn't just built a company with a shaky reputation, he had built it on the broken body of another man. A debt always comes due. It's a phrase you hear in movies, something a grizzled old-timer might say, but sitting there under the weak glow of a desk lamp, it felt like the most profound truth in the universe. The bill for my father's sins had just been delivered to my doorstep, 30 years late, in the form of a man with a clipboard and a heart full of cold, patient rage. I closed my eyes and the memories came flooding back. Not of the accident, I was just a kid then, completely unaware, but of my father. I remembered him at the dinner table, smelling of sawdust and confidence, talking about business. He had this way of talking about problems as if they were just nails that needed to be hammered down. A difficult supplier, a delayed shipment, a nosy inspector, to him they were all the same. Obstacles to be overcome with a bit of pressure or a bit of cash. The cost of doing business, he'd call it, with a wave of his hand. I remembered how proud I was when he handed me the keys to the office after he retired. I'd walked in here, this very room, and made a silent promise to his photograph on the wall. I was going to make the Miller name mean something again. I was going to build on his legacy, but I was going to build it right. What a fool I'd been. You can't build a skyscraper on a rotten foundation. Sooner or later, the whole thing comes crashing down. My phone buzzed, startling me out of my trance. It was Frank. I let it go to voicemail, but he called right back. I knew I had to answer. He was the one constant in all of this, a man who had worked for my father and now for me. He was loyal to the company, but more than that, he was loyal to the men on his crew. Nate, you okay? His voice was gruff, laced with concern. I'm fine, Frank. Just a long night. Listen, he said, his voice dropping lower. About this Peterson guy, I've been thinking. There's something off. I've seen tough inspectors, Nate. I've seen guys who get a thrill out of finding fault. This is different. The way he looks at our logo, the way he walks the site, it's not about the job. It's like he's looking for something else. It feels personal. I took a deep breath. It is personal, Frank. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Frank was from the old school. You didn't air your dirty laundry, and you definitely didn't question the boss. but he was also a decent man. What do you mean? He finally asked. I decided right then that I couldn't do this alone. If I was going to fix this, I needed the truth, and Frank was a part of that history. Frank, do you remember a scaffolding collapse back in '89? A guy named John Peterson got hurt, badly. The silence that followed was heavier than before. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, the dust being brushed off of old buried memories. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. I remember it. Of course I remember it. Your dad, he handled it. What does that mean, Frank? Handled it? He made sure the investigation went smooth. Frank said, the words coming out slowly, as if he was tasting them for poison. He took care of Inspector Davies, made sure the official report said it was a materials failure, something nobody could have predicted. We all knew, Nate. We all knew that scaffolding was second rate. Your dad got a deal on it from a supplier going out of business, saved a few grand. A few grand, the price of a man's ability to walk, to work, to live a normal life. The sickness in my stomach intensified. Did you know the man who fell? I asked. John Peterson, knew of him, Frank said. Good carpenter, quiet guy, had a family, a son I think, a kid, used to hang around the sites sometimes in the summer. My hand tightened around the phone. The inspector's name is Robert Peterson. Another long heavy silence. I didn't need to say anything else. Frank understood. My God, he breathed. My God, Nate, that's what this is all about. Yes, I said, my voice hard. That's what this is all about. That conversation was the catalyst. The moment the weight of the past transformed from a crushing burden into something else, it became a mission. My initial reaction of shock and despair started to curdle, hardening into a cold, clear resolve. This wasn't about saving the company from a rogue inspector anymore. That was thinking too small. This was about correcting a fundamental wrong. I wasn't going to fight Peterson. I wasn't going to try to expose him or get him fired. What would that accomplish? It would just be another injustice piled on top of an old one. It would be my father's way of handling things, hammering down the nail. No, I had to do this my way. I had to pay the debt. But how do you pay a debt like that? A check wouldn't cut it. An apology felt insultingly small. It had to be something more. It had to be an act of structural change. It had to be about building something new and solid on top of the rot. The next day, I didn't go to the site. I didn't call the bank. I called a man named David Chen, a private investigator I'd used once before to do a background check on a shady subcontractor. He was discreet, professional, and expensive. I told him I needed to find someone. John Peterson. I wanted to know everything. Where he lived, what his condition was, what his life had been like for the last 30 years. I needed to understand the full scope of the damage my family had caused. While Chen went to work, I focused on my own investigation. I told Frank what I was planning, that I wasn't going to fight Peterson, but try to make amends. I asked for his help. I needed to know the real story of the collapse, not the sanitized version from the official report. Frank, to his credit, didn't hesitate. The guilt he'd carried for 30 years was a heavy load, and he seemed relieved to finally have a chance to set it down. He started making quiet calls. He reached out to two other guys from the old crew, men who were long retired, living on pensions and memories. I met them for coffee at a small diner on the outskirts of town. They were old, their hands gnarled from a lifetime of labor, their faces etched with a weary wisdom. At first, they were hesitant. Loyalty to a long-dead boss runs deep, but Frank was with me, and they trusted Frank. I didn't ask them for testimony against my father. I just asked them to tell me what they remembered, and they did. They told me about the scaffolding. They called it a widowmaker. They said they'd complained about it to the foreman at the time, a man loyal only to my father's wallet. They were told to get back to work. They told me how the cross braces were flimsy, how the locking pins didn't seat right. It wasn't a one-in-a-million materials failure. It was an accident waiting to happen, a tragedy purchased at a discount. I recorded their stories, with their permission, not as a legal weapon, but as a record of the truth. Each word was another crack in the rotten foundation my father had left me. 2 weeks later, David Chen called. He'd found him. John Peterson was alive. He was 72 years old and lived in a state-funded assisted living facility on the other side of the county. The place was clean but bleak, the kind of facility that runs on a shoestring budget and good intentions. Chen's report was brutally detailed. John had undergone a dozen surgeries in the years following the fall. He had permanent nerve damage in his legs and spine. He could walk, but only with the help of a walker, and every step was a study in pain. His wife had passed away 10 years ago. His only regular visitor, the man who paid the bills that his meager disability didn't cover, was his son, Robert Peterson, the inspector. The report included a photograph. It was a candid shot, taken from a distance. It showed Inspector Peterson, my tormentor, my nemesis, sitting on a bench in the facility's small patchy garden. He was leaning forward, carefully cutting his father's fingernails. The look on his face wasn't one of anger or vengeance. It was a look of profound, bone-deep weariness. The look of a man carrying an impossible weight. That photograph broke something in me. The last vestiges of my anger toward him evaporated, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it almost knocked the wind out of me. This whole time, I had seen him as the villain in my story, the man trying to tear down everything I was trying to build. But I had been looking at it all wrong. In his story, I was the villain, or at least the symbol of it. The name Miller's on the side of a truck wasn't just a company to him. It was a constant public reminder of the man who had crippled his father and gotten away with it. Every building we put up was a monument to that injustice. My plan solidified. It would be a three-pronged approach, a strategy built not on confrontation, but on atonement. First, the public act. I would fundamentally change the way Miller and Son operated. I went to my office and started drafting a new company-wide safety protocol. It was the most rigorous, comprehensive safety plan the industry had ever seen. It went far beyond city code and OSHA regulations. It mandated the highest grade materials, weekly third-party safety audits on all active sites, and an anonymous reporting system for any worker who felt a situation was unsafe, with a guarantee of no retribution. And I gave it a name. I called it the John Peterson Safety Initiative. It was a way to honor his name, to turn it from a symbol of tragedy into a symbol of a new standard. Second, the private act. I contacted my lawyer and had him set up an irrevocable trust. It was anonymous, funded through a series of shell corporations, so it couldn't be traced back to me or my company. I liquidated some old, forgotten land holdings my father had bought decades ago, the only part of his legacy that felt clean, and funded the trust with enough money to move John Peterson out of the state facility and into the best private long-term care money could buy for the rest of his life. It wouldn't give him back his health, but it would give him comfort and dignity. It was the payment for the debt, not a settlement, an acknowledgement. Third, the leverage. I compiled everything I had found into a single, thick file, the ledger of my father's bribes, the transcribed statements from the old crew members, the original, faulty scaffolding specs I'd found in a dusty box of blueprints, David Chen's entire report on John Peterson, including the photograph. This file was not a weapon to be used against Robert Peterson. It was the opposite. It was proof. It was the complete, unvarnished truth of the matter, and it was the only thing that could make my other actions feel sincere. With the plan in place, I felt a strange sense of calm. The fear and panic that had been my constant companions for months were gone. I knew what I had to do. It was going to be the hardest thing I'd ever done. It would likely cost me the company, but for the first time since my father's funeral, I felt like I was finally in control of my own legacy. The first move had to be quiet, but decisive. It couldn't be a conversation or a negotiation. It had to be an action. The following Monday, I called an all-hands meeting at our main yard. Every carpenter, every laborer, every operator, and every foreman was there. Frank stood beside me, his presence a silent endorsement. The air was thick with tension. The guys were on edge, spooked by the shutdown at the Harrison project, whispering about layoffs. They expected me to announce we were going under. I stood up on the tailgate of my truck, a makeshift stage, and looked out at their faces. These were good men. They were the engine of my company, and for too long they had been running on a system that treated their safety as a negotiable expense. Good morning. I started, my voice steady. I know there are a lot of rumors going around. I'm not going to lie to you. We're in a tough spot. But we're not here to talk about shutting down. We're here to talk about starting over. I walked them through it, all of it. I told them that the old way of doing business at Miller and Son was over. Effective immediately, we were implementing a new safety protocol. I didn't use the official name, not yet. I just laid out the new rules. The top-tier equipment we'd be buying. The mandatory weekly training sessions. The third-party audits. The no questions asked stop work authority for any man on any crew who felt a situation was unsafe. You could have heard a pin drop. They stared at me, a mixture of disbelief and deep-seated skepticism in their eyes. This was the kind of stuff you hear about from big-money corporate outfits, not a local firm struggling to make payroll. I know what you're thinking, I said. You're thinking this is expensive. And you're right. It is. It's going to eat up every spare dime we have. But competence isn't cheap until you lose it. We've been operating on a reputation we didn't deserve, and that ends today. From now on, the name Miller's on a hard hat is going to mean one thing. It's the safest site in the city, period. I saw Frank nod slowly out of the corner of my eye. A few of the older guys, men who had seen their share of close calls over the years, exchanged looks. It wasn't a standing ovation, it was better. It was the slow dawn of reluctant belief. The next day, the first shipment of new equipment arrived. Top-of-the-line harnesses, new power tools with advanced safety guards, and scaffolding that was so over-engineered, it looked like it belonged on a NASA launch pad. It was a massive capital burn, money I desperately needed for other things. But it was the first tangible proof that my words were more than just a speech. A week later, Peterson came to the Harrison site to sign off on the remedial work we'd done on the 4th floor. It was the first test. Frank was there to meet him. I stayed in my truck a block away, watching, my heart pounding. I saw Peterson walk the floor, his clipboard at the ready. I saw him running his hand along the new anchor bolts, measuring the spacing with a digital caliper. He spent an hour up there, then another. Frank called me. His voice was laced with a kind of bewildered amusement. You are not going to believe this, Nate. He's been up here for 2 hours. He checked every single bolt we replaced. Then he started checking the ones that were already fine. He's now on his hands and knees inspecting the subfloor for splinters. The man is coming unglued. He can't find a thing wrong. Peterson's script had been flipped. His weapon, the city codebook, was useless against a site that didn't just meet the code but dramatically exceeded it. He had come expecting to find the usual Miller and Son corner cutting, the predictable flaws he could exploit. Instead, he found a fortress of compliance. He was a hunter who had walked into a clearing to find his prey had built a castle. He eventually signed off his signature, a tight, angry scrawl, but he didn't leave. According to Frank, he spent the rest of the day just watching. He stood on the perimeter, a silent, brooding figure. As my crews began implementing the new protocols, he saw them double-checking harnesses, setting up safety zones, and taking their time. The deliberate, unhurried pace of professionals, not the frantic rush of a crew trying to beat the clock. He was watching his revenge become obsolete in real time. He looked confused, rattled. His power was derived from our flaws, and I was systematically taking them away. The pressure didn't just come from Peterson, though. Mr. Harrison, the developer of the tower, was getting colder feet by the day. The shutdown had spooked him, and he was hearing whispers from his bankers about the risk of using a contractor with a history like mine. He called me, his tone clipped and professional. He was thinking of exercising the termination clause in our contract. It was a kill shot Peterson hadn't been able to land, but one my own reputation might deliver. I didn't try to argue with him over the phone. I asked him to meet me on site the next day. When he arrived, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that seemed out of place against the raw concrete and sawdust, he had the look of a man about to deliver a death sentence. Nate, he began, I appreciate your efforts, but my investors are concerned. The delays, your company's reputation, it's becoming a liability. I understand, Mr. Harrison, I said calmly. Before you make your final decision, would you give me 10 minutes? He agreed, reluctantly. I didn't walk him through the construction progress. I didn't show him Gantt charts or budget reports. I walked him through the John Peterson Safety Initiative. I showed him the new equipment. I introduced him to Frank, who explained the new stop work authority given to the crew. I showed him the reports from the independent safety auditor I'd hired, whose first assessment had just come in. I didn't mention Inspector Peterson by name. I didn't air my dirty laundry. I framed it as a proactive strategic shift. The old Miller and Son had a reputation for being fast and cheap, I said, looking him directly in the eye. And frankly, it earned that reputation. I'm building a new Miller and Son, one that has a reputation for being the safest and most meticulous firm in the city. It's a bigger upfront investment for me, but for you, it means your project will be built to a standard that no one can question, and your liability will be virtually zero. Harrison was quiet for a long time, watching a crew on the floor above us carefully erecting the new scaffolding system. He was a numbers guy, a man who thought in terms of risk and return. He understood what I was really offering him. It wasn't just a building, it was certainty. "All right, Miller," he finally said, his tone shifting from dismissive to intrigued. "You've got my attention. I'll call off the bankers for now. You get 1 more month on a probationary basis. Show me this new standard isn't just for show." It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a stay of execution. The ticking clock had been paused. As Harrison walked back to his car, I felt a small, unfamiliar flicker of something that felt like hope. I was fighting a war on two fronts, one against a ghost from the past, and one against the very reputation that ghost was born from. And for the first time, it felt like I might actually be able to win. The change wasn't immediate. It was like turning a massive cargo ship. It took time and immense energy, but slowly a new rhythm began to establish itself on our sites. The initial skepticism from the crews gave way to a grudging respect, which then blossomed into a quiet, professional pride. They held their heads higher. The work became cleaner, more precise. The frantic energy of cutting corners was replaced by the calm confidence of doing the job right. And something I hadn't anticipated started to happen. Word gets around in the construction trades. It's a small world of calloused hands and shared gossip. The story of Miller and Son's transformation began to spread. It wasn't a press release or an advertisement. It was carpenters and electricians talking over beers after work. They talked about the new equipment, the third-party auditors, the fact that the boss's son was on site every day, not in an office, but in a hard hat. Good people want to do good work. They want to go home at the end of the day with all their fingers. The best tradesmen, the ones who were tired of being told to look the other way by their own foremen at other companies, started quietly putting in applications with us. It was a talent exodus in reverse. While other firms were struggling to find skilled labor, we were suddenly getting our pick of the city's best. Frank came into my office one afternoon, a stack of applications in his hand, a rare smile on his face. "It's working, Nate," he said, tapping the stack. "These are top-tier guys. We've got a waiting list for framers for the first time since your dad ran the show, but for a completely different reason. Our shoddy reputation was being dismantled, one skilled hire at a time, replaced by a new one built on the foundation of safety and quality." The change was palpable. Peterson saw it too. He kept coming to our sites, his visits becoming more frequent, almost obsessive, but his power was gone. He'd walk the floors, his eyes scanning, desperately searching for a vulnerability, a crack in the armor. He found nothing. The sites were immaculate. He was like a phantom, a ghost haunting a house that was no longer his. His frustration was a visible thing. He'd slam his car door a little too hard when he left. His reports would come back with 0 infractions, but filled with passive-aggressive notes about observing protocols. He had lost his leverage. So he did what desperate people do. He escalated. He couldn't attack my work, so he attacked my name. He decided to fight me not on the job site, but in the court of public opinion. He leaked a story. A local trade journalist, a guy known for his sensationalist gotcha pieces, suddenly got an anonymous tip. The tip was a detailed list of every fine, every violation, and every shutdown Miller and Son had incurred over the past year. All of them, of course, issued by Peterson himself. It was a carefully crafted narrative designed to paint me as an incompetent, dangerous contractor, a man running his father's cursed company into the ground. It was an attempt to spook my clients, my lenders, and my own crews. It was a Hail Mary pass, a desperate counter-manipulation to regain control. The journalist, a man named Simmons, called me for a comment. His tone was predatory, hungry for the kill. "Mr. Miller," he said, "I'm running a story on the alarming number of safety violations at your company's sites. It seems Inspector Peterson has had you dead to rights for months. Would you care to respond to allegations that you're running the most dangerous operation in the city?" The old me would have panicked. I would have been defensive, angry. I would have played right into his hands. But the old me was gone, buried under a pile of my father's lies and my own hard-won resolve. I was calm. "Mr. Simmons," I said, my voice even, "that's a very serious allegation, and it deserves a serious, detailed response. In fact, the story is much bigger and more complex than you realize. Why don't you come to my office tomorrow morning, say 10 o'clock, and I think for the sake of transparency, we should invite Inspector Peterson to join us. I'm sure he'd be very interested in this conversation." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. This wasn't the reaction he expected. I wasn't hiding. I was inviting the fire. Yes, of course," he stammered. "I'll reach out to him." "Excellent," I said. "I'll see you both tomorrow." I hung up the phone. The power shift was complete. He thought he was coming to my execution. He had no idea he was walking into my vindication. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the thick file I had prepared. The ledger, the witness statements, the PI report, the photo of a son tending to his father. It was time to show them the real foundation. The next morning, the air in my office was thick with a tense, formal silence. Simmons, the journalist, sat in one of the chairs opposite my desk, his digital recorder placed squarely in the middle, a smug, expectant look on his face. Next to him sat Inspector Robert Peterson. He looked rigid, uncomfortable. He was on my turf now, out of the context of a muddy job site where his clipboard gave him authority. Here he was just a man in a room. He avoided my gaze, staring at a point on the wall just over my shoulder. I let the silence hang for a moment, letting it work on them. Then I leaned forward and placed the thick file on the desk between us. It landed with a solid, definitive thud. "Thank you both for coming," I began, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of the room. "Mr. Simmons, you called me yesterday about a story. A story about my company's safety record, and you're right to ask questions. But you've only been told the last chapter of a much longer story." I opened the file. I didn't look at Simmons. I looked directly at Peterson. His eyes finally met mine, and for the first time I saw a flicker of uncertainty behind the cold mask of his anger. "This story," I said, sliding the old leather-bound ledger across the desk towards him, "begins here. About 30 years ago, my father kept meticulous records." Peterson's eyes dropped to the ledger. He didn't touch it, but I saw his jaw clench. Simmons leaned forward, his journalistic curiosity piqued. "And it continues here," I said, adding the transcribed, signed statements from the old crew members to the pile. "These are from men who were there. Men who remembered the truth of what happened on May 12, 1989. I saw a muscle twitch in Peterson's cheek. He knew what was coming. "You see, Mr. Simmons," I continued, my voice still calm, almost conversational, "Inspector Peterson wasn't wrong to believe that Miller and Son had a debt to pay. He was right. There was a debt, a profound one. A debt of negligence that was covered up by bribery." I slid the original, doctored safety report and the specs for the faulty scaffolding onto the pile. "A debt that was incurred when my father chose to save a few $1,000s at the cost of a man's health." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. Simmons was staring at the documents, his eyes wide, the smug look completely gone, replaced by the hungry gleam of a man who realizes he's stumbled onto the real story, a story far bigger than a simple tale of a failing company. Finally, I took out the last document. It was David Chen's report. I didn't slide it over. I kept it in front of me, and I turned the first page so they could both see the photograph. The picture of Robert Peterson in the garden of the assisted living facility, caring for his father. The debt, I said softly, was your father's life, Mr. Peterson. The life he should have had. The pain he has endured for 3 decades. And your pain having to carry that burden for him. You were right to want justice. You were just delivering the bill to the wrong man. I looked him straight in the eye. There was no threat in my voice, no anger, only a deep, resonant sincerity. I can't undo what was done. I can't give your father back his health. My father's sin is a stain that I can't wash away, but I can try to make it right. I slid 2 final documents across the desk. The first was a detailed portfolio outlining the irrevocable, anonymous trust I had established for John Peterson's lifelong care. The second was the official, company-wide manual for the newly implemented John Peterson Safety Initiative. The trust is for your father's care and comfort, I said. It's already funded. It's done. He can be moved to a private facility as early as next week. The safety initiative, that's for every other man who ever works for this company again. It's so that the name Peterson is never again associated with a tragedy at Miller and Son. Instead, it will be the standard by which we measure our commitment to protecting our own. I leaned back in my chair. That's my comment, Mr. Simmons. The story here isn't that my company was failing. The story is that it was built on a lie. And the story is about how my father's son is spending every dime he has to fix it. That's the real story. You can write that one, or you can write the petty, incomplete version you were given. The room was utterly still. Peterson just sat there, staring at the file. His face was a canvas of conflicting emotions. The rigid mask of his 30-year vendetta was crumbling, revealing the weary, burdened son underneath. He looked from the trust documents to the photo of his father, then back to me. The anger in his eyes was gone, replaced by a profound, shell-shocked confusion. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. There were no words. His entire worldview, the righteous crusade that had defined his adult life, had been completely and irrevocably dismantled in the space of 5 minutes. He stood up slowly, mechanically. He didn't look at Simmons. He gave me one last, long, unreadable look, and then he turned and walked out of the office without a word. Simmons, the journalist, was practically vibrating with excitement. He looked at me, then at the pile of documents, then back at me. Mr. Miller, he said, his voice full of a newfound respect. Can I quote you on all of this? You can print all of it, I said. The truth is the only foundation worth building on. The article came out 2 days later. It wasn't on the back page of the trade journal. It was on the front page of the city newspaper. The headline was The Son's Atonement, how a local construction firm is rebuilding its foundation of trust. It told the whole story. The collapse, the cover-up, the son's misguided but understandable quest for justice, and my attempt to pay a debt I had inherited. Miller and Son Construction was suddenly, improbably, the talk of the town. We weren't the symbol of shoddy work anymore. We were the symbol of redemption. A week later, I heard through the grapevine that Robert Peterson had quietly resigned from his position as a city inspector. He didn't get fired. He wasn't exposed. He just disappeared. He was free of his vendetta, and I was free of his pressure. The war was over, and I had won, not by destroying my enemy, but by understanding his pain and healing the wound that had created him. The new workplace reality was one of my own making, built not with bribes and shortcuts, but with honesty and a heavy price paid. A price that, in the end, bought back my family's name. A year has passed since that day in my office. Miller and Son Construction is thriving. We're not the biggest firm in the city, but we are the most respected. We get the jobs that require absolute precision, the clients who value quality over the lowest bid. The Harrison Tower stands tall in the center of downtown, its glass facade gleaming in the sun, a monument not to my father's ambition, but to a new way of doing business. My crews are the best in the business, and they work with a pride that you can't buy. Frank, now my general superintendent, walks the sites with a lighter step than I've ever seen. Last month, I received a small plain envelope in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was a single photograph, a simple Polaroid. It was of John Peterson. He was sitting in a comfortable-looking armchair on a sunny porch overlooking a lush green lawn. He was smiling. It wasn't a big smile, but it was genuine. He looked at peace. Tucked into the back of the photo was a small handwritten note. It had only 2 words. Thank you. I knew who it was from. I keep that photo on my desk. It's a reminder that a legacy isn't just about what you build, it's about what you're willing to repair. It's about understanding that sometimes the most important work we can do is to pay the debts left behind by those who came before us. We inherit their structures, their names, but we also inherit their cracks, their rot, their ghosts, and we have a choice. We can either paint over the cracks and pretend they aren't there, or we can dig down to the foundation and make it right, no matter the cost. For a long time, I was haunted by my father's ghost. Now I think I've finally given him, and John Peterson, and his son some measure of peace. I built something on a solid foundation, both in the skyline of this city and in my own life. You know, everyone faces their own version of this. Maybe it's not a 30-year-old secret, but we all inherit situations, reputations, and problems that aren't of our own making. The question is what we do next. Do we perpetuate the cycle, or do we find the courage to break it? True strength isn't about winning a fight. It's about having the wisdom to see when a debt needs to be paid and the integrity to pay it in full. Competence isn't just about building things right, it's about making things right. I'd really like to know what you think. Have you ever had to fix a mess that someone else made? Let me know your story down in the comments. And if you found some value in my story, do me a favor and like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and please, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for more stories about turning the tables. Thanks for listening.